Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're checking out the Gigabyte M34WQ, a more budget-oriented ultra-wide gaming monitor using a unique flat IPS panel. In the ultra-wide market, getting an IPS panel has typically cost a small fortune, with high-end products such as the LG 34G and 850 commanding over $1,000 US, but the M34WQ is just half that price and offers a compelling alternative to the usual curved VA monitors we get in this price range. The basics to this display are as follows: a 34-inch 3440 by 1440 flat IPS panel with the usual ultra-wide aspect ratio of approximately 21:9. It supports up to a 144Hz refresh rate with adaptive sync technology and comes Display HDR 400 certified, which almost certainly means it's a fake HDR monitor. We're also getting typical Gigabyte monitor features like a KVM switch.
Today's video sponsor is Thermal Grizzly and their Cryonaut Extreme, which is now available in a 2-gram syringe. This high-performance thermal paste delivers maximum thermal conductivity thanks to an extremely small particle size and layer thickness. It's also very flexible, capable of standing up to sub-zero temperatures for extreme overclocking, but also performs exceptionally well for air and water cooling applications. So if your CPU or GPU needs repasting, then I suggest checking out the Thermal Grizzly range. Link is in the video description.
One of the more interesting aspects to the M34WQ is its flat screen, compared to the curved options that dominate the ultrawide market. The last time I looked at a flat ultrawide was back around the launch of FreeSync, if I recall correctly. Don't even remember what year that was. It was a long time ago. But for buyers of this display, is the flat screen a benefit or a negative? If you've been following my reviews for a while, you have probably heard me complain about curved monitors before, especially for the regular 16:9 format, where I think it introduces distortions and hurts the experience in most cases. But for ultrawides, I actually don't mind a mild to moderate curve. The width of these displays can often dominate your field of view, unlike with 16:9 monitors, so bringing the edges in slightly with the curve can help the monitor feel more immersive and easier to view in your peripheral vision. The M34WQ being flat makes the left and right edges feel further away from your eyes than the center, which you don't get as much with a curved ultrawide, though that might just be because I'm so used to the curved variants. At the end of the day though, while I don't think the flat panel is quite as immersive as a curved variant, it's not a huge deal, and there are some benefits here. If you plan on using this monitor for productivity or content creation work in addition to gaming, having the panel being flat will eliminate any potential distortions from showing flat content on a curved screen. It's also potentially better for those viewing from a larger than normal viewing distance. The rest of the design is typical of Gigabyte's non-Aorus monitors in that it's basic but functional. The panel section on the front does have a rather large chin that perhaps could have been smaller, but the rest is standard. Almost all of the build is covered in some plastic of some form, whether matte black or glossy black, which looks fine, and there's no RGB LED elements to waste money. It's not overly gamer in its design either, so it's going to fit in well with most setups thanks to a neutral color palette. The stand uses Gigabyte's normal big wide layout and features height adjustability, which is a must for all monitors in 2022. You can also swivel and tilt the display if you like, so ergonomic adjustments are good. There's a directional toggle to control the OSD and an above average feature set enhanced through the addition of a KVM switch and several gamer features like crosshairs and stats dashboards. I don't tend to give much thought to features as a lot of them are gimmicks, but I do have to give credit to Gigabyte here because I feel the KVM is a genuinely useful addition if you use one display with multiple inputs. As for ports, we have one DisplayPort 1.4, one USB Type-C using DP-Alt mode, and two HDMI 2.0 ports. Gigabyte advertises DisplayPort as using DSC, but it's not necessary for this resolution and refresh rate. The bigger issue to me is only including HDMI 2.0, which limits the max resolution refresh rate to 100 Hz using those inputs. HDMI 2.0 is outdated and insufficient technology for this display. It really should have HDMI 2.1 to allow the maximum 144 Hz over HDMI. For overdrive settings, Gigabyte include 5 modes, one of which is the Smart OD mode, which still doesn't work very well and often chooses the wrong overdrive mode. We'll start here with performance in the off mode, which is quite slow, reporting in with only a 14.5 millisecond gray to gray average, though with 0 overshoot. I don't think many gamers will be opting to turn off overdrive on this display. Picture quality overdrive improves performance at 144Hz, now with an 11.5ms average and still no overshoot of concern. But we can do better with the bounce mode, which delivers a 7.04ms average response time and minimal overshoot. This is the ideal mode for gaming, delivering a cumulative deviation of just 573 and no dark level smearing, which is in contrast to VA alternatives. It's not the fastest result I've ever seen from an IPS, but it's also not too bad. Then we have the speed mode, which increases response times further at the cost of noticeable overshoot and inverse ghosting, so I wouldn't recommend using this mode. Unfortunately though, the M34WQ doesn't deliver a single overdrive mode experience. As we look at the bounce mode, this setting holds up at 120Hz, but displays noticeable inverse ghosting at 100Hz. Once we get down to 60Hz, there's a pronounced bright trail following moving objects as a result of this inverse ghosting, so the bounce mode is not ideal for lower refresh rate gaming. In contrast, the picture quality mode is visibly slower than the bounce mode in terms of blur and clarity when gaming at 144Hz, but holds up much better at lower refresh rates. There is still a small amount of overshoot at 60Hz, but this mode is very usable for gaming here and a big upgrade on the bounce mode. This leaves the M34WQ with two optimal overdrive settings: bounce if you plan on gaming closer to 144Hz, and picture quality for lower refresh rates. You'll need to swap between these settings for the best experience, which is annoying and could have been solved with variable overdrive, though on a mid-range monitor, I don't necessarily expect that sort of feature, and in this price class it's rare to get a single overdrive mode experience. If you do want to set and forget a single mode for variable refresh rate gaming, I would recommend the picture quality setting. The key thing to look at though is how the M34WQ stacks up compared to other monitors. When comparing at the highest available refresh rate and the best overdrive settings, this display is notably faster than VA alternatives like Gigabyte's own G34WQC and others like the Samsung Odyssey G5. The M34WQ is 43% faster than Gigabyte's VA model and 72% faster than the Samsung, which is a very noticeable difference that will be visible while gaming. Meanwhile though, it is still a little bit slower than high-end IPS monitors like the LG 34GN850 and MSI MEG381CQR. On average across the refresh range, the M34WQ suffers from needing to reduce the overdrive setting to mitigate inverse ghosting at a lower refresh rate. The experience here is still better than the G34WQC thanks to much lower overshoot, but response times are similar. Meanwhile, it's only marginally faster than the Odyssey G5 and quite a bit behind the LG 34GN850 now. We could have achieved around a 6.6ms average using the bounce mode, but this would have increased the inverse ghosting rate over 30%, much higher than its competitors. Cumulative deviation shows us how that balance between response times and overshoot plays out in a single metric. The M34WQ comes in at 703, which is only slightly ahead of its VA competitors on average across the refresh range, and again I feel a bit of optimization would have increased its ranking here. Other IPS ultrawides score 15% better and were outside the range of today's best IPS displays in general, though this is to be expected as the M34WQ is a more budget-oriented mid-range product. While average performance may only be slightly superior to VA displays in some areas, the main reason in my opinion why you'd choose this IPS over a VA is in dark level smearing. The M34WQ doesn't really have dark performance issues, while its VA competitors do. This IPS model ends up 36% better in dark performance than the best VA ultrawide I've tested outside of Samsung's 32:9 stuff, but in some cases performance is up to twice as good. At a fixed 120Hz, like we saw at 144Hz, the M34WQ is quite a bit faster than its VA counterpart, so if you're mostly planning on playing at high refresh rates, the advantages to going IPS over VA are significant. However, at 60Hz, it's more of a mixed bag. The M34WQ is still faster using optimal settings for all monitors, but it's not as substantially faster. VA monitors are generally better at lower refresh rates compared to higher refresh rates, so that helps those products here. Input latency is a non-issue with a sub 1ms processing lag. The main limitation here is more the refresh rate of 144Hz and moderate response time, so it's not going to feel or act as fast as high refresh rate monitors for competitive gaming, but for casual everyday gaming it's still a nice, smooth and responsive display. Power consumption is as expected, matching other ultrawide monitors when calibrated to 200 nits, a good result and also a non-issue. Gigabyte do include backlight strobing here, and it's their aim stabilizer sync technology, so it can be enabled simultaneously with adaptive sync. That's nice, but it's let down by some feature limitations, namely the lack of any tuning controls, it is just an on-off switch, and lack of 60Hz support, so it's a kind of take it or leave it proposition. The actual performance of the backlight strobing mode is mediocre, and I probably wouldn't use it on this basis. The panel simply isn't fast enough to allow for a clean strobe, there's a noticeable double image, a bit of fringing, and also a bit of blur. I don't think this is a significant upgrade on the non-strobe image, so yeah, not the best feature. For color performance, the M34WQ uses a wide gamut panel, and as we can see here, it has about 92% DCI-P3 coverage, which is okay. Not the full coverage you'd want to see for color accurate work, but good enough for viewing P3 content. However, the gamut coverage is red dominant, so we don't get great Adobe RGB support, which covers more greens. So basically, with this display, you're getting full sRGB and near full P3. This amounts to 72% coverage of Rec 2020, which is acceptable and slightly higher than you'll see from most VA alternatives. Factory calibration is okay with decent adherence to sRGB gamma out of the box. However, my unit had a slight red tint from the factory, which impacted Delta E grayscale performance. The M34WQ also comes without an sRGB gamut clamp enabled by default, so regular SDR content is somewhat oversaturated, and this leads to average Delta E's for saturation and color checker. When compared to other displays, the M34WQ competes well for grayscale calibration, not too bad there, while color checker averages are typical for this class of display, and no, nothing too amazing. An sRGB only product like the Odyssey G5 has notably better factory calibration for viewing SDR content. However, this display does come with an sRGB mode, which does clamp the gamut to near sRGB. This improves accuracy quite a bit for saturation and color checker tests. It's not a perfect result, but among the sRGB modes I've benchmarked, this is slightly better than average. Unfortunately though, grayscale performance still suffers from a red tint, and this can't be changed as the sRGB mode has white balance controls unnecessarily locked. Performance can be improved through a full calibration using CalMan, bringing sRGB performance to accurate levels, which is perfect for content creation and consumption. It's a little bit more difficult to calibrate for P3 though, as we don't have full gamut coverage, so we can only get part of the way to an accurate experience, but this is still good enough for viewing P3 content. The M34WQ is an average monitor in terms of brightness, topping out at 380 nits, fine for everyday usage. Minimum brightness is a little on the high side, but I also expect that to be good enough for most users in darker environments. The contrast ratio here is an interesting story. Among IPS monitors, the performance here is pretty good, a little above the 1000:1 average we expect, and better than more expensive products like the 34G and 850. However, in this market, there are a lot of VA alternatives, and quite frankly, the M34WQ's IPS panel is not up to the standards set by these displays. The G34WQC and Odyssey G5 have contrast ratios in excess of 3000:1, which is around 3 times as good as the M34WQ, delivering much deeper blacks, which is most noticeable in a darker room while gaming. You do get a faster panel, but this is obviously quite a big trade-off. Viewing angles are decent being an IPS panel, and the fact it's flat helps out here as well. Uniformity was okay as well, not a terrible result by any means, and no obvious areas of poor performance, just an average display these days when it comes to this area. Gigabyte advertises display HDR 400 certification, but there has been no attempt to include actual HDR capable hardware, so this is firmly a fake HDR display. There is no local dimming here whatsoever, so the panel is simply incapable of the contrast requirements for displaying HDR content. This is an instant fail for an HDR monitor, and then on top of that, it doesn't get bright enough either, so I wouldn't buy this at all if you want an HDR experience. The final section of this review is new for 2022, and we're calling it the Hub Essentials Checklist. This is a series of checks to assess a monitor for key feature inclusions and misleading advertising, measuring the listed specs and features compared to our testing results. This is in response to the growing trend of misleading advertising and dodgy specifications, such as the recent destruction of HDMI 2.1 branding. Gigabyte fail multiple items in this checklist, such as by having insufficient HDMI bandwidth for the full refresh rate of this monitor, locking white balance controls in the SDR mode, and not having a single overdrive mode experience. Gigabyte also exaggerate the performance of this display, saying it has a 1 millisecond MPRT response time. I'm not a fan of slapping MPRT on there to excuse a panel that's otherwise incapable of 1 millisecond transitions. This is basically marketing BS revolving around the backlight strobing mode, which itself is hardly impressive. If you say it's a 1 millisecond monitor, it should produce realistic 1 millisecond response times, which this display does not. The biggest area of penalty is the HDR performance. Gigabyte fails 5 of 6 criteria by advertising HDR capabilities, but then delivering fake HDR. However, there are some positives in this checklist too, such as the lack of defects like pixel inversion, good refresh rate compliance, and generally accurate reporting of color metrics. Gigabyte gets a tick here for not incorrectly advertising factory calibration. Overall, the Gigabyte M34WQ is a good ultrawide gaming monitor. What I like most is how balanced it is across the various areas of performance. There's no big negatives like dark level smearing, just nice and consistent performance, which is one of the major benefits to IPS panels. I can see this display being well suited to budget and mid-range gaming setups for those that want to dabble in ultrawides. While this monitor is very balanced, there's also no standout area to performance. Response times are good and better than VA alternatives in this price category, helping to deliver a clearer gaming experience, but it's not equivalent to a high-end monitor like the LG 34G and 850. Similarly, while I think the M34WQ is a great monitor to look at, it has just average wide gamut coverage, and areas like factory calibration are nothing special. But again, we're in a jack-of-all-trades type situation, so if you just want a bit of everything, the M34WQ is going to be decent. And I do think this is in contrast to the curved VA monitors you might be considering instead. Those displays have far better class-leading contrast ratios, but the drawback there is in slower response times, particularly the introduction of dark level smearing. They're basically min-maxing those stats, while this IPS equivalent from Gigabyte is going with a balanced build. Which approach is better for you is something you'll need to decide on based on how you use a monitor and what matters most to you. I don't think there's a clear-cut answer. There are some negatives to this display as well. Gigabyte failed 12 of 36 checklist items, with big penalties for exaggerating response time performance and delivering only fake HDR. The flat panel has some benefits, but I feel a slight curve would have improved the experience, and the contrast ratio, while not terrible, is a lot worse than VA alternatives that deliver deeper blacks in dark rooms. There's also not that much to say when it comes to pricing. Gigabyte is selling the M34WQ for $500 US, right in the mid to lower price range of 3440 by 1440 ultrawides, which I feel is very fair. Competitors using VA panels like the G34WQC, again from Gigabyte, start at $50 to $100 cheaper, and at times can actually be more expensive, like the Samsung Odyssey G5. So I think the M34WQ being similar to those VA options, if a tad more expensive, is right around the mark, and I'd comfortably recommend it at $500 US. Anyway, that's it for this review. If you're interested in supporting our independent monitor reviews and allowing us to buy products for review, then consider supporting us on Patreon and Floatplane. You'll gain access to things like the ICC profiles we create during the calibration process, and our Discord community where you can ask questions about monitors to us at any time. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.